Where in the Qur'an is it written that women must wear veil and cover themselves?
Where does the term hijab come in the Qur'an? The term hijab itself has gone through a lexical change in meaning. So for example, initially, the hijab was used to describe a barrier, such as in Surah Isra, verse 45, it says, "And we have placed a hidden veil between you and those who do not believe in the hereafter." So over here, the term hijab itself, the hidden veil, has been put down as hijaba. So hijab itself initially meant a barrier or to conceal or to cover. Now, as we go through time, it has changed meaning, which now refers in its technical meaning to the headscarf and the long loose clothing that we wear. But now we need to see where in the Qur'an are we commanded to wear the hijab? Because the question that often comes forward is, the Qur'an does not talk about the hijab at all. But we have several technical meanings in the Qur'an that we need to go through them one by one in order to understand how the scholars have been able to derive the current hijab ruling. So you have terms such as khimar, jilbab, yudnina alayhinna. Now let's start with khimar. Khimar itself initially meant something that covers the head. And we derived that also in pre-Islamic poetry, where it was referred to as something that covered the head. So it was something that was used across the whole of Arabia, and the pre-Islamic poets used to use it to describe, for example, the freshness of trees. That's khimar. So khimar in its linguistic meaning meant something that covers the head. In its technical meaning, comes about to be the same as something that covers the head. Then we look at the word jilbab. What does jilbab mean? According to the Arabic linguists, jilbab comes from the root word jalaba, and it refers to the act of bringing something close together. So the act of covering over. And then we have the other technical term in the Qur'an, yudnina alayhinna. Yudnina alayhinna again refers to drape over. Now I'm going to refer to the different verses of the hijab, and we will see where these verses come in, how we can derive this ruling. But before that, we also need to consider the idea that the verses were revealed in a specific timeline. We will go through this timeline and see how it adds up together. So let's start with the verses of the Qur'an. So there are three surahs that talk specifically about hijab: Surah A'raf, Surah Ahzab, and Surah Nur. So for example, you have وَقَرْنَا فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ وَلَا تَبَرَّجْنَ تَبَرُّجَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةَ الْأُولَى, which is in Surah Ahzab. And then you have another surah, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّبِيُّ قُلْ لِأَزْوَاجِكَ وَبَنَاتِكَ وَنِسَاءِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يُدْنِينَ عَلَيْهِنَّ مِنْ جَلَابِهِنَّ. So we discussed what jalbab means, and we discussed what yudnina alayhinna means. And this comes in Surah Ahzab again, verse 59. And then you have in Surah Nur, وَلَا يُدْنِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. Now you see, when the verses were revealed, initially the verses, I'm going to go through all the verses. Now we've only discussed 3 verses, but in total we have about 6 verses that speak about the hijab. The verses that I mentioned only mention the technical meaning that we just discussed. So the verses of hijab talk about how Shaitan was expelled Adam and Eve by pulling off their clothing, as happened with in the story of Prophet Adam and the apple. And then you have the story about do not display your finery like those in the day of ignorance. The 3rd verse talks about the prophet and the wives of the prophet, and how the believers should ask them from behind a screen. And then do not display all your ornaments, and let them wear the khumur over the chests. And so we have these different verses that talk. Now we need to see the timeline of the verses. Often what people have tried to put forward the idea is that hijab was designated to different societies. So what they say is that different segments of society had a different hijab. For example, the hijab of the wives of the Prophet was different to the wives to those of the believers. Or the hijab of the slaves was different to those of the believers. However, when we look at the timeline of revelation, we see first Surah A'raf was revealed, then Surah Nisa, then Surah Ahzab, and ultimately Surah Nur. Now when we put all of this together, we see that the hijab and its prospect was revealed in a manner to prepare societies to slowly adopt the hijab in the current form that we have. And this is derived because of the slow revelation of ruling. And we see that in the Qur'an that this method was followed also in terms of alcohol. Alcohol was slowly dismissed from society through through a timely revelation, and finally it's revealed. So when we look at all the verses of the hijab, the final verse was the one that commanded the wives of the Prophet, the believers, and all the believing women. And this includes slaves. Therefore, the notion that hijab was separate for different segments of society is nothing but a falsification of and wrong interpretation of the Qur'an. So let's see what we can derive from these verses. In total, when we put all these verses together, we come up with several verses. One, there is a gradual nature of legislation that happened with the hijab, where khimar was the initial directive, that is the head covering, and then the verse of the hijab was the final directive. So basically, initially the women were commanded to wear the head covering, then they were told to drape over everything, over the chests, and this was universal. So it's not slaves had a different ruling. This did not happen, and it is very unlikely. The evidence as well that we have is is not sufficient to address the idea that slaves had a different hijab. All the slaves, as well as the believing women, had one hijab, and there was no differentiation within the hijab. The second point that we get from these rulings is that the wives and the jilbab was for all believing women, and there is no exception at all for this ruling. The directive on how to wear the jilbab as well was titled as Yudnina alayhinna min jalabihinna, which means to draw the outer garments over themselves, which is more compatible with the cloak, like the way we have in some societies, in the Arabic societies, we have the term of abaya, or in the Iranian societies, it is referred to as a chador. And the fourth point that we get from these verses is that the social impact of hijab was addressed, which is that is more suitable that they will be known. If women were supposed to be hidden from society, how would it be that the verse would say that they would be known? It would be that they would be hidden, but the verse doesn't say that. The verse says that they wear the hijab so that they are known and they're not abused. Therefore, the hijab was not designed to silence women or take them away from society. It was designed for them to enter society in a much more respectable manner. So then we come to the final point. How was hijab practiced in the time of the Prophet? In the time of the Prophet, we have several narrations, and one of them is when Sayyidah Fatima is in regards to Sayyidah Fatima, which says she covered her head with a khimar and enveloped herself in a jilbab. Therefore, all the verses that we took, she addressed it in a way in her own clothing. That means she wore a khimar, head covering, and a jilbab, which is a cloak that covered her entire body. And with that, with all these evidences, we come to the conclusion that the hijab is not different in between different segments of society. Rather, it was one across the whole of society, and it meant a head covering and a cloak that covers the body.